This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit Podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. Bob Stein worked at Atari Research for 18 months beginning in 1981. He was hired by Alan Kay. He worked almost exclusively on an encyclopedia project, a potential collaboration between Atari and Encyclopaedia Britannica that never went anywhere. I learned about Bob after he uploaded an item called the Atari Drawings to Internet Archive. It's a collection of 9 colorful pencil drawings, drawn in 1982 by Disney animator Glen Keane. The drawings depict futuristic scenarios where people use a computerized encyclopedia to get information. For instance, an earthquake wakes a couple in the middle of the night. The Intelligent Encyclopedia, connected to an online service, informs them of the severity of the earthquake and makes safety tips readily available. And a mother and her children, looking into a tidepool in Laguna, ask the Intelligent Encyclopedia about the plants and animals that they see. Bob described the collection of art in his introduction to the document. Here's what he wrote. In 1982, executives from Warner Incorporated, Atari's parent company, were scheduled to visit the research lab where the encyclopedia project was located. Brenda Laurel and I came up with these scenarios to give the execs a sense of what we were looking toward. The drawings were made by Disney animator Glen Keane. When you look at these, remember that they were made 16 years before Google and 12 years before Yahoo, even 8 years before the earliest web-based search engines. He continues, that said, one of the most interesting things about these scenarios as seen today is that, with the exception of the image of the architect and the teacher, none of them indicated any inkling that the most important element of the web to come was that it would bring people into contact with each other. What we see here is almost entirely people accessing content from a central server, no sense that we would be communicating with each other or uploading our contributions to the collective culture. My own explanation for this lapse focuses on the print-era mentality that saw readers purely as consumers of content. Bob saved and scanned a large number of materials from his time at Atari and uploaded them to Internet Archive. In addition to the scans of Keane's Atari drawings, the documents include memos about the Encyclopedia project and a transcript of a 1982 seminar for Atari Research featuring Charles Van Doren. Check the show notes for those links. After Atari, Bob was co-founder of the Criterion Collection, which restores and distributes important classic films, and co-founder of the Voyager Company, the first commercial multimedia CD-ROM publisher. In 2004, he co-founded the Institute for the Future of the Book, a think tank investigating the evolution of discourse as it shifts from printed pages to network screens. This interview took place on December 16th, 2023.
I grew up in New York City, upper middle class, private school, Columbia, then Harvard. But it was the 60s, so my most important education was probably in the streets. We thought we could change the world, and we were out there in various ways being political, whether it was, I worked for several years in Harlem building community centers and got arrested a lot of times protesting the war in Vietnam and various Black liberation struggles. Sort of standard stuff for the times.
So I know that you worked at Atari starting in 1981. You were there for about 18 months. And I believe you worked almost exclusively on this encyclopedia project. Is that right?
Yeah, I had, up until my mid-30s, I was a full-time political activist, and for various reasons decided to stop that, mostly selfish ones. I had 3 children, and revolution was going to be much further in the future than we had thought, and I wanted to do something more interesting. At that point, I got interested in the work that was going on at MIT with interactive video, and had been sort of struck by a comment by chief scientist at IBM who talked about putting an encyclopedia onto a disk And I wrote a letter to, one of the things I was doing as an activist was I was running a revolutionary bookstore in Seattle. And I wrote a letter to our sales rep, who became the head of vice VP of sales at Random House. And I wrote to him asking if I could buy the rights to the Random House Encyclopedia to render electronically. And I mentioned in there that I thought that the Random House Encyclopedia, which was graphically based, was much more interesting than the sort of stodgy Britannica. And I knew nothing. I mean, I literally knew nothing. And a friend of mine asked me what I was into at that moment, and I sent her a copy of this letter that I had sent to the guy at Random House, and I had forgotten that her father was on the board of Britannica, or maybe I never knew. And so she gave the letter to her father, and about a week later, I got a phone call from the president of Britannica, Chuck Swanson, who said basically, if you know so much, why don't you come and talk to us? I didn't know anything, but I found somebody who did. I got him to come to Chicago with me. He sort of put on a flawless demonstration. And I got hired by Britannica to think about their future. And I spent, I don't know, the bulk of a year sort of traveling around the country, visiting laboratories with the imprimatur of Britannica. And I wrote a paper that I think is still rather prescient about what the Encyclopedia of the Future could be like. And when that was done, Alan Kay, I had mentioned, I think I'd said in this paper that the Encyclopedia of the Future was likely to be a joint venture of Britannica, Lucasfilm, and Xerox. And so Alan Kay leaves Xerox and goes to Atari as their chief scientist. And I get in touch with Alan and I go to see him, and he reads the 120-page paper while I'm sitting there in his office, and he hires me. And he says, this is exactly what I want to do here. Come and work with me on it. So I did. And, Atari wasn't going to do anything in this area, but it was a fun playground for me to be in, to think about stuff with a bunch of really smart people. And at the end of it, yeah, so that's pretty much that story.
Okay. It's an interesting, I mean, you have Encyclopedia Britannica, which a company that had been around for 100 years and was, I think, a stodgy company that knew how to sell books, piles of expensive paper-bound books. And you had Atari, which was a company known for games. And so I think maybe both companies were out of their element in creating an
No, I
encyclopedia.
don't think so. No, I mean, Britannica, the editorial head of Britannica was a guy named Charlie Van Doren, who you might know the name from the quiz show.
Quiz show
He,
scandal 21.
and Charlie was a techno enthusiast of the first order, and he would have loved to go in that direction. And Alan's research group was mostly filled with the first class of master's students from the MIT Media Lab, and there was a deep interest in intellectual products. I think that, I mean, hiring Alan was a brilliant move for Atari. The sadder thing is that the guys in the suits in New York never really understood what they had. In other words, Atari was technically much more interesting than Apple at that point, and the research group at Atari was stunning. I mean, Atari could have done anything. It was more that I don't think it was overreach. I think it was just sort of one of those sort of bad timing moments when the suits at Warner's, they had no, they were out of their element for sure with Atari. And, they had that sort of disaster with Pac-Man and E.T., I guess, and they just didn't recover from it.
Sure. One of the things you uploaded to your Internet Archive collection is a collection of Atari art created by a Disney artist of these beautiful ideas of what people could do with a portable electronic encyclopedia,
Right.
and which is they're great and well worth looking at. And the impression I got, or something I read somewhere, is that that was really created in order to impress upon the New York Warner suits like why this was interesting. These weren't really new ideas, but you were
Well,
trying to
I
convince
I
those
don't
folks.
know. I mean, they were and they weren't. I mean, definitely the purpose of that was for a dog and pony show we were doing for Warner execs. But and the scenarios in those images, um, I mean, we could show those on here if you want to.
Sure,
But
I'd love to look at them and talk about them. Do you want to share your
um,
screen?
so Alan had a relationship with famous Disney animator named Glen Keane. And Brenda Laurel and I sort of came up with suggestions for what these scenarios would be. And Alan asked Glenn. And so when you look at these, you have to remember this is 1981. This is 17 years before Google's even founded. Um, these are a bunch of kids running around the Museum of Natural History, and they're holding terminals in their hands, and they're asking questions of what they're seeing. And on the wall, these are also windows into the encyclopedia that the kids have access to. This is a father giving his son a tour of 1960s rock and roll, and this is the encyclopedia here up on the wall. Sake was sort of coming into its own at that point, and this is a California rancher sort of asking the encyclopedia what it would take to change his land from grape growing to rice growing. There's an earthquake, and a couple turns to their encyclopedia to find out what do you do in the case of the earthquake.
Mm-hmm.
This is classroom with kids being kids, basically, either doing the assignment or playing games with each other. But the encyclopedia could do both. And a businessman on an airplane, sort of with a drink in one hand, holding on to and talking to encyclopedia. It's interesting about this image because it's 11 years after this was done. I'm sitting on an airplane with a Mac, with the first Mac PowerBook with the first electronic books on it. And I've got a drink in one hand, and I'm reading a book and turning the pages by tapping with my finger. And I'm sort of blown away by what a different experience it is in ways that I never expected. Sort of the comfort of holding the drink and not having to have put the drink down to turn the page of a book, etc. This is a bar game being driven by the encyclopedia. This is a teacher in Japan looking at Western architecture with her kids, while an architect in the States is studying Japanese architecture for a project he's doing. This one is my favorite. This is a mother and her kids in a Laguna Beach, and it's a tide pool, and they're asking the encyclopedia, they have a camera on there, and they're asking the encyclopedia questions about what they're seeing in the tide pool. And I'm particularly amused by the fact that this has an antenna. So it was obviously wireless, And again, this is so much before we had any of this technology. So yeah.
These are amazing. How did we do? I mean, now it's 40 years later. We can do all these things. Is there anything that we missed, you think? Anything we missed out that was in the vision that was missed out on?
Well, yes. I mean, it's an interesting question. Now that we have ChatGPT or Bard, we're a lot closer. I mean, you don't have the institutional buy-in that this implies, right? I mean, these are actual encyclopedia um, screens, as it were, because they have the encyclopedia running in the walls of the museum. So we don't have that. Um, Surely we have this, although not as elegant, I have to admit. YouTube never looked quite this way. But you're actually right. I mean, I think that basically all this functionality, um, don't know that we have bar games yet. We could. Um, and we get close to these things. We don't quite have the Google Lens is a little bit problematic to use in this context, but yeah, you're right. I mean, all these years later, especially thanks now to ChatGPT, we're here.
Of course, none of these are showing the 30 seconds of forced ads you have to watch before you can identify the
Yes,
thing in the tide pool.
that too. Interestingly, I was going to go back and show you, since we have this up and running, I thought your audience might like to see this. Here are 3 Atari games running inside of a browser simultaneously in this little thing that we built.
It's amazing. Yeah, the Internet Archive's emulator, in browser emulator. Yep, we got Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and asteroids all running at once. It's amazing. Tell me about this. I was experimenting with this thing before, this tapestry viewer. Is that something that you created or just a tool you use?
No, it's something that some colleagues, let me stop sharing. Colleagues and I have been working on from 2 perspectives. One is basically how to make the Internet Archive's collection more useful. So we're trying to find a way for people to go and sort of grab things and sort of place them into this endless canvas. Um, it Another way of saying this, which some of your audience might appreciate, is we sort of want to bring back HyperCard, but in a way that actually works and can go on into the future. I mean, it's painful to me that all these years later we have nothing even resembling HyperCard that people can use.
HyperCard was amazing.
Yeah. Well, the first thing Steve Jobs did when he returned to Apple was kill HyperCard.
So at the time you were looking at this encyclopedia project, um, the the goal was to do this on video disc or maybe do it online.
No, I don't. I think it was definitely online. I mean, I came to it from the video disc world, but once I got to Atari, I mean, those guys they were only thinking way, way ahead. I mean, in some ways, 25 years ahead, whereas I tend to get stuck 10 or 15 years out. And yeah, I mean, when I left Atari, I started a company to do video disc stuff, but that was because I wanted to do something, and we weren't anywhere near the technology for the encyclopedia. But you could do something interesting on a laser disc at that point.
So was the encyclopedia was your exclusive focus at Atari, I think. Is that accurate?
Yes, yes, except that I, since I'm not a scientist and I had no computer skills whatsoever, I was, I tried to make myself as useful as I could. And one of the things I did was I took it upon myself to fly to New York every few weeks to go visit the suits up on the top floor of 75 Rockefeller Center and try to explain to them what it was they actually owned. I failed miserably, but I did sort of become the representative of the research group to other parts of Warner's. I mean, it was, I was able, I wasn't bad at least having a conversation with those people, even if nothing ever came of it. Um, the I remember the guy named Stan Cornyn, who was the sort of new projects guy at Warner Records. Stan and I worked together we held a series of symposia for Atari Research and Warner Records about about the future of all that stuff. Um, they knew CD-ROMs were coming, but you know the big legacy media companies, have done a particularly have done a particularly bad job of embracing new technologies. Um, and Warner's was no exception. It's not that the people in the companies couldn't grasp stuff, they could. These were generally really smart people in all these companies, but there's something about the legacy aspect made it very, very difficult for people to sort of get down and dirty and be experimental and explore. Because with a new technology, you have to sort of be willing to sort of start from scratch and say, I don't know what the fuck is going on here, and noodle until you come up with something. But that's not the way that big companies work. They want success out the door, and you can't really promise that when you're developing inside of a completely new technology.
Right. Isn't that sort of the point of the research? Any research lab, though, is to be thinking 20 years out.
Yeah, but it was interesting. I mean, I remember at one point Alan went to the the higher ups at Atari and Warner's and said, "You guys don't have anything in the pipeline. Let me go to Japan and let me source something that'll hold you for 5 or 10 years while the research group actually builds what could be next." And they never understood that. I mean, Alan gets criticized all the time, I think, for having been too much of a blue sky kind of person or a sort of dreamer, which he was in all the wonderful ways that means something. But he also understood what was going on, and he had a pretty good sense of where Atari sat in the sort of river at that moment. But they didn't listen to him. They weren't able to hear what he was saying, and you had what you had, or what happened happened.
Sure. In my research, I kept seeing phrases around you like you were envisioning a rich media landscape and preaching the gospel of an electronic future back in the 80s and 90s. Did did we get there? Did we get to what you wanted to see? Do we have more farther to go?
You know, yes and no. I mean, as you pointed out, we've gotten to a lot of where we wanted to get to. I would say the one huge piece that's missing, and it's what Tapestries has to do with, is the ability for everybody to express themselves in this new domain. I mean, yes, you absolutely have, kids with an iPhone uh, making movies that, compete with Hollywood, and that's fantastic. But I want more than movies. I want to be able to mix and match. I want the great promise of the Media Lab at MIT, or it was the Architecture Machine Group Lab at the time, in the late 70s and early 80s, was that authors would be able to have at their beck and call all media, so that if a point was better made with video, they could use video. If a point was better made with text, they could use text, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's one thing we don't quite have yet, which is, powerful multimedia environments where anybody, where 10-year-olds can do stuff. And the other thing we don't have is a social component. Um, the ability for people to read together or to watch together. There are bits and pieces of it, but it's never really come together. And if the internet, I mean, it's very interesting. If you look at the Atari drawings, they're all basically people working on their own with taking, accessing things in the encyclopedia. What you don't have there is a lot of people coming together to collaborate. And I think that is the most, if we go back to where Alan and Doug Engelbart and some of these guys, early people, they were fundamentally looking to the internet as a place for collaboration. And sure, there are examples of it, but it has never really been front and center. And we don't really have the kind of deep collaborative environments that these guys were imagining in the 60s and 70s. So I yeah. So I mean, your question is an interesting one. And in fact, it's worthy of a symposium to, I think, to go back and take the vision of these early pioneers and stack it up against what we have. Interestingly, the whole idea for tapestries came from a film that we've found of Alan talking at MIT in 1995. It's a symposium about Vannevar Bush. And Alan basically devotes, it's 11 chapters, one to each of early pioneers: Sutherland, Engelbart, Licklider, Minsky, etc. And it's very clear in Alan's rundown that the ideological basis of these early guys was so different, in the sense that A, collaboration was front and center, and B, their goal was really to use computing, digital technology, to make the world a better place. But by the mid 70s, the narrative has shifted, and the press is focusing mostly on Bill Gates and Michael Dell and making huge amounts of money. And so the trying to figure out how to get people uh, to think about these issues today is not trivial, because you we're just not used to interrogating the past in a very active way to inform the present. I mean, it's ridiculous that we don't, but we don't.
Is it true that you and Alan Kay took an airplane to work every day from Southern California to the Bay Area?
Not every day. Probably average 3 days a week,
Nice.
uh, at least together. Yeah. I mean, Alan, we both lived in LA, and this was before 9/11, so you could get to the airport 5 minutes before your flight. And Atari was rolling in money, and it was interesting. Warner's gave us unlimited expense accounts, but wouldn't buy us any machines. So you had a situation where you had all these computer scientists who could go anywhere in the world they wanted to, but they couldn't buy a $10,000, mini computer. And Alan and I used to go, and it was, I mean, Alan is a computer scientist, and 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 his great love is music. And on the odd day, we would go together and come back together. So I'd be spending 5 hours a day with him, and he would talk to me most of the time about music, which I knew nothing about. I love music, but I'm not musical. Or he would talk to me about computer science. And I think I learned early in life how to nod to people so they thought I understood, which is good and bad. It gets them to keep talking, but they don't necessarily know that you don't have any idea what they're talking about. Um, but that was but that but what that actually played a huge role in my work, in the sense that um, I decided to learn something about music. So I took a music appreciation course at UCLA while I was traveling with Alan. And the professor who taught one of these was just a brilliant, brilliant lecturer. And I realized several years later, when CD-ROMs, I guess it would have been, no, it was when I left Atari, and Stan Cornan from Warner's gave me some money to think about what they were going to be up. This would have been 1983, probably early 1983. And he gives me a bunch of money to think about the CD-ROMs. And I come back with a paper with 10 ideas in it. And the first idea is basically a recreation of this class at UCLA. And long story short, that leads to something called the CD companion to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which was sort of the first commercially viable CD-ROM, where we basically had that professor comment on Beethoven's Ninth Symphony across the length of it, similarly to what we were doing with Criterion with the films, and putting a commentary on there.
Like director's commentary of
Yeah,
the symphony.
yeah.
Nice.
And I mean, it worked beautifully. And
Can you tell me about the Institute for the Future of the Book?
when I left Voyager and Criterion in 96, I took with me the senior programmer and the senior producer, and we spent 4 years doing HyperCard, really recreating HyperCard in a different way, a little bit more powerful, but more limited. And interestingly, Microsoft was our principal investor, and Dick Brass from Microsoft, his what he said when he invested was, "Oh, this is HyperCard done right." And he invested, and we did it. And wanted, we went back to them and said, "Okay, we finished the coding. We want to bring it to market." And they said, "Great, as long as you kill the Macintosh version, we'll give you the money." And I wasn't willing to do that. So we ended up it ended up being an orphan company.
Hmm.
Um, and there were then several years of where I was sort of in the sticks, as it were. I was stuck. It was a I, the problem is when Microsoft is your major investor and things go south, you just nobody will touch you. And so I got a phone call one day from the MacArthur Foundation, and they said, um, "We really liked it when you were publishing. How can we help you go back into publishing?" And I said, "Well, I this would have been 2004." And I said, "I'm not sure what it means to be a publisher right now, but if you want to give me some money, I'll think about it." Because the internet, because CD-ROMs were dead and the internet was coming, it was there. And so they asked me how much money I needed, and I told them, and they said that's not enough. So they made me, they ended up giving me $1 million. And so I started this thing called the Institute for the Future of the Book, which was really, my intention was to explore what it did mean to publish. And I hired these three really smart kids who were just out of university with degrees in, I think, all in English literature. And we sat around a table for a year and talked to each other and basically started experimenting with what happens when you locate a text. And for me, a text can be literal words, or it can be audio or video, any linear program. What happens when you put a linear program into a browser with a dynamic margin where people can sort of meet and talk about what they're looking at and reading and seeing? And this just ended up being incredibly exciting and powerful. And that was, we did a lot of experiments, a lot of interesting experiments. And we looked in general at what was happening on the web. And when that was a 5-year gig, and when that was over, I started another company called Social Book that tried to build a platform for all forms of sort of social media consumption. And we built an amazing platform, but it was the right platform at the wrong time, because it was as the iPhone was exploding and or had I mobile had exploded. It wasn't as it was mobile had exploded while we were building this, and we had built something that worked on a desktop or a notebook, and it, the VC environment just had no stomach for anything that wasn't mobile. Maybe they were right. I don't know. I still don't think the phone is necessarily the right platform for everything. Um, and so that was yet another orphan. And anyway, so
So what are you doing today? What are you doing these days?
well, I'm doing two things. I mean, one is the Tapestry project, which I think is the most important work I've done. Because for the very first time, we feel like we're not uh, we're not bound by linearity in quite the same way. We're building something which lets people put ideas wherever they want into a field and connect them as they want. And out of this will come sort of new ways of communicating. It'll take time, but it will happen. Um, the other project is sort of unrelated, but I'm absolutely convinced that the way that we record performance using 2D cameras is ridiculous at this point, and that I want to use VR to reinvent the way that we record and stream live performance. I live in New York because there's more live art here than any other city in the world, by probably in almost order of magnitude. And I see amazing work all the time, and I want to share it. And it is completely shareable via VR if somebody would just give us a goddamn camera that would work. And I think Apple is about to, it looks like, it iPhone 15 now will now shoot 3D video, and it's probably good enough for basement tape quality. And I think that once people start seeing what it looks like inside of the high res headset, we're going to start to see all kinds of cameras and headsets. It's I, I Jaron Lanier was in the research group with us at Atari in 1981. I was there at TED in 1990, when he did the first public demonstration of a headset. So that was 33 years ago, or 40 years ago, if you want to count all the way back to Atari. And it's been a long, slow climb, but we're about to get there. It may still be 5 years off, or maybe 10 years off, but kids are going to be we're going to be living in our headsets in one way or another, for good or for bad. It's going to be so compelling. People are going to be amazed.
I found you because you were uploading these Atari documents to Internet Archive. And at the time, several months ago, you said that you were working on a book. And I think that's how you worded it, or you're working on a project or something. Anyway, so I was wondering, like, what you've uploaded the stuff. Is anything going to be?
Well,
where are you going with this?
So I gave my archives to Stanford because they claimed, and I think they were honest, that they understood that the goal was to get everything online, and to get it online in a way that was useful, both contextualized and collaborative. So, but they also agreed that that there was no platform even remotely good enough for what I had in mind. So I had a colleague from the Institute for the Future of the Book who I wanted to work with on thinking this through. And it occurred to me early on that it was sort of absurd to build a platform just for my archive. Why not do something bigger? And Brewster and I had talked for years about the Internet Archive in terms of, he's always claimed that he appreciates my sense of, sort of design and user interface. And so I convinced Brewster to hire my colleague and let us sort of think about building a front end for the archive, and tapestries came out of that sort of noodling and that thinking. My goal, I think, is to get Tapestry 1.0 built, and then work on annotating my archive at Stanford. And I've always imagined that, it would be mirrored at the Internet Archive, and in some cases, the Internet Archive would allow me to put stuff up that Stanford wouldn't. I've always been aware of that issue, but people keep saying, mentioning the idea of writing a book, but I'm not particularly interested in writing a linear book, both because so much of my work involves media, and I don't want to render ideas only in text. It's not interesting to me as a problem. I mean, I keep thinking it'd be nice if somebody would write a New Yorker profile of me, but I don't want to do that. I'd like to do something much more interactive and much more multimedia oriented. The other thing is I'm not particularly nostalgic, and I I'd rather I'd rather build new things than hash out the things I've done. Um, but it's tricky because I think that, as I said earlier, getting being able to get younger people to look at what some of us older people were focusing on 30, 40 years ago, I think has value.
Sure. What are you excited for going through? It sounds like you're excited about VR goggles, and I saw you did some writing about ChatGPT and that sort of thing. What are you excited for going forward tech
I,
wise?
you know, I guess to put those two together, do you know the name Muriel Cooper?
I do not.
Muriel Cooper was a researcher at MIT in the visual studies uh, shop workshop, and in 1990 or 92, she showed a video which was basically a three-dimensional word cloud, and she showed people uh, um, so basically flying through three-dimensional data. And I think that Dan and I, from the first moment we saw a tapestry, sort of imagined that the proper home of tapestries will be inside of headsets, and that they won't be two-dimensional, they'll be three-dimensional, and you'll zoom into a portion of a tapestry, and it will, you'll zoom in and zoom out of idea clouds, etc. Um, so it's interesting. One of my oldest grandchild, um, I saw her over Thanksgiving, and she just started university, and she said, "How's the tapestry project going?" And I said, "Well, it's a little bit stalled because we don't have any money to actually build version 1.0." And it was so wonderful to see her face. She was just crestfallen. Not for me. She said, "Oh, I really, really hope you get to do it because tapestries are so cool." And I see my grandchildren, not her, but the younger ones, playing games endlessly in headsets. And I realized the that the kids who are early teens now, late, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, these kids really are digital natives, and they are not going to be as resistant to putting on headsets, etc. And I I see all kinds of problems with technology. And it makes me, I get concerned when I see my grandkids on their phones all the time. And I don't know what's going to happen when they're in headsets all the time. But I do know that the fundamentals of human communication are going to change profoundly. And we're right in that, the change started in the 70s, and it may take 100 years. It may be another 50 years before we really are where we're going to end up. But if humanity manages to survive, I mean, that is one of the one of the big questions here, is what's the future of not of technology, but the future of humanity within the context of technology. And I don't know. I mean, there's, you know, you could get me to be on the dystopian um, podcast today and the utopian one tomorrow. I mean, I can spin both stories. Um, sadly, it's easier to spin the dystopian one today.
Luckily, you're only on the Atari podcast, so
Yes.
we don't have to decide one way or the other. What haven't I asked you about your time at Atari that I should have?
Not sure. Alan, The thing about Alan that was interesting was that he would hire people like me who had absolutely no cred whatsoever. Alan just had this ability sort of to, I mean, I, it was wonderful working with him. I mean, I think I sent you one of the things in that tapestry about the Encyclopedia project was I wrote Alan a 10-page memo at one point about various directions we could take. And Alan just wrote on it, on the top, do it, which to have somebody, sort of believe in you at that level was fantastic. And it really enabled me to dream. And those dreams went somewhere. I think that it, I, going just, I want people might appreciate the story. They wouldn't let us buy machines, but they let us spend whatever we wanted on travel. I took 20 people once to New York for Laurie Anderson's United States performance. It was 4 nights
Excellent.
performance. And I, took 20 people from all the way from California to New York just for that. And even better, Alan had worked out a deal with, he was talking with Lucasfilm and with Spielberg about doing something really substantial in terms of building uh, a digitally enhanced amusement park. So I took, uh, again, 20 odd people from the research group to Florida to visit, just to go to Epcot and to see a shuttle launch. These were, boondoggles, I guess, but it was incredibly exciting to be with all these smart people and to be able to sort of travel in that way and to think about what was possible.
Wild.
I mean,
Yeah.
that it's one of the interesting things about showing tapestries to people. When I show them to young people, they look at them and they say, "Oh, what's the big deal? I could code that in a day." And I say, "Yep, you could, but you didn't because you didn't understand why it might be interesting." But when I show tapestries to Alan, as I have, or I show it to Vince Cerf, they go bananas because when they see it, they go, "Oh, fuck, somebody's actually doing what we imagined the internet was going to be like 40 years ago." And I think that one of the reasons why tapestries are interesting and why I want to get my archive and other people's archives up in really usable, explorable ways is because one of the interesting things about transitional moments, and you'd have to say that that period of the 70s into the 80s is transitional. It really is the end of the print era and the beginning of the digital era. And those liminal moments when there are no rules, when there are no standards, when you're inventing a vocabulary, it's where a lot of the really interesting ideas start to be developed. And to the extent that we can get people today who are building the future to get them to see some of these ideas that we had in the old days, which obviously you can't just take them and move them over to here. You have to completely re-understand them, but they're worth considering. And I mean, something like the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony CD companion. It's insane to me that there aren't libraries of all the great jazz works, all the great classical works. I don't know, even you can even put all the great rock and roll in there, where people try to sort of help, enable you to understand these things. I mean, we've got it with the Criterion Collection, interestingly, although Criterion sort of got frozen. If we released the first film in 1984, Citizen Kane and King Kong, and the form, sort of film with commentary track with supplementary section, is exactly with the form of the Criterion Collection today. there could be so much integration with the computer, but there isn't, right? I mean, there are all kinds of things one could imagine one could do with in terms of explaining a film, but they don't do any of that. So, you know, I'm always interested in building bridges between the way past, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and the present and the future. I think that the reduction of friction and the ability for people to explore is, in one way or another, that's, has always been my goal. But Atari, by the way, it was a fun place. I was glad to have the time there.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, please consider supporting my Patreon at patreon.com/savitz. I've been publishing interviews like these since 2013 and would like to continue doing so for a long time, and your financial support will help. Thanks.